The wind howled like a banshee, tearing across the frozen plains, rattling the window panes of the small, isolated cabin. Inside, Ilara, barely 16, hugged her younger sisters closer. Lily, 12, shivered not just from the cold, but from fear. And little Maya, only 7, coughed weakly, her breath shallow and feverish. Their parents had been gone since the autumn, taken by the fever that swept through the territory. Now, winter had settled in with a vengeance, a white, unforgiving death grip. Their last sack of flour was empty, the woodpile dwindling to a few meager logs. In the distant town, a cluster of buildings barely visible through the swirling snow, desperation clawed at the hearts of its people. Sheriff Barnes, a good man worn down by the elements, stood in the saloon, his breath misting in the cold air that seeped through the cracks. "The pass is closed," he announced, his voice heavy. "Another attempt, and we lose good men. Those poor girls." He trailed off, the unspoken "they're as good as gone" hanging heavy in the air. Mrs. Elkins, the town matriarch, wept openly, her face etched with sorrow. They had tried. Lord, they had tried. But the blizzard was a living beast, devouring any who dared challenge it. No one spoke of the silent cowboy. Silas. He drifted through town sometimes, a lone wolf on his painted horse, never lingering, never speaking beyond a curt nod or a muttered word for a drink. He seemed to carry the weight of distant mountains on his broad shoulders, his eyes like chipped flint. A mystery, an outsider. But Silas had seen the frantic comings and goings, heard the desperate whispers. He knew the girls' parents, had traded with them once, long ago. As Sheriff Barnes made his grim pronouncement, Silas simply stood by the window, watching the snow fall, his face unreadable. Then, without a word, he walked out. The town watched, puzzled as he saddled his horse, loading it not with supplies for himself, but with sacks of dried meat, blankets, a small bottle of medicine. He took a heavy axe, a coil of rope. He didn't head for the main pass, the one now choked with snowdrifts. Instead, he turned his horse towards the unforgiving, jagged peaks to the north, a route no sane man would ever consider in such a storm. A forgotten trail, treacherous, prone to rock slides and avalanches. A trail Silas had stumbled upon years ago, a path only madness or a desperate kind of courage would choose. The journey was a brutal test of will. The wind bit through his thick coat, freezing his beard to his face. Snow fell relentless, blinding, piling up to his horse's chest. He dismounted, leading the horse, breaking trail through drifts that swallowed him whole. He felt the rumble of distant snow breaking loose, barely escaping one thundering avalanche that roared down a slope he'd just cleared. He pushed on, his muscles screaming, his fingers numb, driven by a silent, unseen force. He didn't know why, didn't know what compelled him. Just the image of 3 small faces, alone against the vast, indifferent wilderness. He found the cabin on the 3rd day, a ghost in the swirling white. He stumbled through the door, half frozen, nearly collapsing. Ilara, pale and wide-eyed, stared at him, clutching Lily. Maya was barely conscious, her breathing ragged. Silas didn't speak. He just moved. He built up the fire, forcing warmth back into the cabin. He brewed hot broth from the dried meat, coaxed sips into Maya, spoon-fed the others. He rubbed the girl's frozen limbs, changed Maya's damp clothes, wrapping her in his own spare blanket. He worked through the night, a silent guardian, his own body aching, but his resolve unyielding. For 2 more days the storm raged. Silas nursed Maya, shared their meager warmth, and told them quiet stories of the land, of resilience. He didn't talk about himself, just the strength of the mountains, the quiet wisdom of the animals. He was a silent anchor in their storm. When the blizzard finally broke, a fragile sun peeked through the clouds, casting a dazzling, blinding light on the pristine snow. Silas, gaunt and clearly injured, a deep gash visible on his forehead, rose stiffly. "Time to go," he rasped, his voice hoarse from the cold. He helped the girls bundle up, now stronger, hope flickering in their eyes. He led them, slowly, deliberately, towards the town, navigating the treacherous, newly exposed path he had forged. He leaned heavily on his horse, moving slower with each step, but he kept moving. As they neared the town, the community was gathered, huddled together, their faces etched with despair. They had given up. They looked up, and a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. A lone figure, moving slowly, deliberately, leading 3 small forms through the snow. It was Silas, and beside him, Ilara, Lily, and a small, bundled Maya, alive. A stunned silence fell, then a choked sob from Mrs. Elkins. A wave of profound relief, of disbelief, washed over the town. They rushed forward, tears streaming down their faces. Tears for the girls, yes, but mostly tears for the silent man who had brought them back. They saw his gaunt face, the frozen injury, the way he swayed with exhaustion. He hadn't just gone through the storm. He had fought it, wrestled it, and won. As the first townspeople reached them, Silas finally swayed, his eyes closing, and collapsed into the snow, the effort of his silent, impossible choice having consumed him completely. The town rushed to him, a new understanding dawning in their tear-filled eyes for the quiet man who had faced death alone, not for glory, but for 3 orphaned girls he barely knew. And in that moment, the whole town wept, their hearts overflowing with a grief and gratitude too profound for words. The townspeople rushed to Silas, carrying him gently into the saloon, now transformed into a makeshift infirmary. Sheriff Barnes, his face etched with worry, examined Silas's wounds. Mrs. Elkins, her tears now mixed with a fierce determination, organized the townsfolk, setting about tending to the girls and preparing food and warm blankets. For days, Silas hovered between life and death. The fever he had been fighting, coupled with the exposure and the exertion, threatened to claim him. The town, usually divided by petty squabbles and the harsh realities of frontier life, united in a silent vigil. They brought what little medicine they had, took turns sitting by his bedside, whispering prayers and stories of gratitude. The girls, especially Maya, clung to Mrs. Elkins, their small faces pale with worry. They had found a new protector, a silent giant who had braved death for them, and the thought of losing him was unbearable. Slowly, stubbornly, Silas began to recover. He woke to find the saloon quiet, the townsfolk watching him with a mixture of awe and relief. He didn't speak, just nodded slightly, his eyes still holding that distant, flinty gaze. But there was a new warmth in them now, a flicker of something akin to peace. As Silas regained his strength, the town rallied around the girls. They rebuilt the family's cabin, stronger and warmer than before. They shared their meager supplies, ensuring Ilara, Lily, and Maya would never go hungry again. Mrs. Elkins took them under her wing, teaching Ilara the skills she would need to care for her sisters, while the town schoolteacher, a kind woman named Sarah, took on their education. Silas, though still a man of few words, became a quiet presence in their lives. He would visit the cabin, bringing small gifts, a carved wooden bird for Maya, a warm shawl for Ilara. He would sit with them in the evenings, sharing stories of the stars, his voice a low rumble that soothed their fears. He taught Ilara how to track, how to read the signs of the land, skills that would help her survive in this harsh world. He never sought praise or thanks, but the girls' growing affection, their shy smiles, were reward enough. A year passed. The scars of the winter storm faded, replaced by a new sense of community. A bond forged in shared hardship and the quiet heroism of a lone cowboy. The town, once suspicious of Silas, now saw him as one of their own, a protector, a silent guardian. They still didn't know much about his past, his reasons for his solitary life. But they didn't need to. They knew his heart. One spring evening, as the wildflowers bloomed across the plains, Silas sat on the porch of the girls' cabin, watching Maya chase butterflies. Ilara, now a young woman with a quiet strength of her own, joined him. "She asks about you," Ilara said softly, gesturing towards Maya. "They all do? They want to know your story." Silas looked out at the horizon, his face unreadable. "Some stories are best left untold," he said, his voice a low rasp. Ilara nodded, understanding. "But you're part of our story now, Silas," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You saved us. You gave us a future." Silas looked at her then, a rare, gentle smile touching his lips. "You saved yourselves, Ilara," he said quietly. "You just needed a little help." He stood, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. He mounted his paint horse, the familiar creak of leather the only sound. He looked back at the cabin, at the three girls who now stood in the doorway, their faces filled with love and respect. He nodded once, a silent promise, then turned his horse towards the vast, endless plains. He was still a lone wolf, a wanderer, but he carried with him the knowledge that even the quietest actions could echo through the hearts of others, that even a silent cowboy could bring a whole town to tears, and in doing so, plant the seeds of hope in the face of death.